Greetings, my fellow knights. Tonight we journey back to the Viking Age, to step aboard a longship and feel the salt spray of the North Sea on our faces, to hear the creak of oars, the clash of shields, and the prayers whispered before battle. We often imagine raiders as fearless warriors chasing treasure and glory, but the truth was far more human. Hunger, fear, exhaustion, and the desperate hope that each raid might change their fortunes. And before you drift into comfort, I ask you, as a fellow knight of these tales, to like and subscribe, and in the comments, share into what other period of history you would like to experience. Now, take up your axe and steady your courage, for the raid begins. Chapter 1. Winter Oaths at the Hearth. You stood by the hearth with Leif at your side while the elder named the raid and the shares. You ran a hand along your wool tunic to feel the seams, and Leif checked the thongs on his belt. The elder spoke in a steady voice, and you set your seeps on the belt where your hand could find it without thought. Leif lifted your cloak from the peg, and you looked over the stitching at the hem again. You ate a wedge of barley bread with goat cheese, and Leif took the other piece without a word. The smoke smell hung in the hall and settled into cloth and hair. You nodded as the elder called each name, and Leif straightened when his came. The men around you shifted on the benches, and you laid your round shield where you could reach it. Leif counted the iron rivets on his CX sheath, and you tightened the leather around your waist. The elder tapped his staff once on the floor, and you met Leif's eye in a quiet understanding. It was midwinter in the hall by the fjord, and dusk had come early over the fields. You stood near the long fire while Leif fetched a new strap from his chest. The cold edged under the door and reminded you why the cloak needed a good pin. The elder listed the shares again, and you listened for where your place fell. Leif would row with you on the starboard side, and you said you would take the night watch with him as well. The benches held packs and spare cords, and you set your gear in a neat bundle by your shield. Leif rolled his blanket and tied it with braided yarn, and you tucked your whetstone into a corner of your kit. The elder named the steersman and the man to mind the anchor, and you watched each nod in turn. Leif spoke softly of the tide he had watched that week, and you liked that he kept the small things in mind. The elder's wife passed a wooden bowl down the benches, and each man took his share without fuss. You checked your wool tunic again, running a finger along the side seams to be sure no stitch had given way. Leif held out your cloak pin, and you worked it through the cloth until the wings lay flat. You set your sakes at the right place on the belt, and Leif pushed the sheath so it sat at a sensible angle. The barley bread and goat cheese sat warm in your stomach, and the salt taste lingered at the back of your mouth. Leif spoke of his mother's worry in a few words, and you told him your brother would look in on your door while you were gone. You laid a bone needle and a roll of flax thread inside your pack, and Leif added a short length of seal cord for mending. You turned your cloak inside out to see if the hem would catch on bramble, and Leif laughed once and said it would hold. You checked the board grips on your shield and ran your thumb over the leather strap, and Leif knocked the rim with his knuckle to test it. You both nodded when the elder said raids were not won by strength alone, but by care and small order. It was an old lesson that suited the moment, and we kept the pace steady here so nothing important slipped past. You stepped closer when the elder raised the small bowl, and Leif stood beside you without needing a word. The elder named the raid in plain terms and set the shares so no man could claim confusion later. He gave 2 for the ship, 1.5 for the captain, 1 for each oarsman, with a portion kept for repairs and the winter poor. Leif accepted that tally with a nod, and you did the same because it kept peace among friends. The elder spoke the oath for all to repeat, and you said the words in your own quiet voice, while Leif did the same in his. You set your seeps on your belt again to feel its balance, and you fixed the knot so it would not slip. The elder touched the bowl to the hearthstone and gave a sip to the log ends, and the men nearest him lowered their eyes. The warmth from the fire brushed your knuckles while you held your hands out to settle the skin after the work. Leif slipped your spare cord into his pouch and asked you to keep a spare pin for him, and you agreed because that was how you had always managed. The elder set the bowl down and said the name of the steading where the provisions would be loaded at first light, and you set that name in your mind like a peg in a hole. You looked over the bundle you had made and found that nothing lay loose, and Leffy did the same with his pack. The clear shares and the simple oath meant you could put thoughts of quarrel aside and keep your mind on the work to come. You settled your cloak over both shoulders and felt the scratch of wool at the back of your neck where the seam rubbed. Leif weighed the small purse at his belt and smiled because his wife would manage it well while he was away. You ate another bite of bread so the long night would not leave you hollow, and Leif sipped from the bowl when it came back around. The elder spoke of the tide and the path down to the shingle, and you marked the steps in your head one by one. Leif said he would bring the coil of rope from the shed before dawn, and you promised to bring the iron hook you kept by your door. It was all quiet talk and small planning that kept men steady, and it may not have seemed like much then, but it mattered later. You tied a strip of cloth around your mitten so the tear would not widen, and Leif tucked a spare strap into your pack because he had one more than he needed. The elder nodded at the pair of you because the small order showed, and you let that sit as a simple kind of praise. You sat on the bench with Leif while the fire sank and the night lengthened. The elder gave a last word about the sled for the gear, and you said you would help lash the runners. Leif stretched his legs and set his boots to dry where he could find them in the dark, and you placed your cloak as a pillow. The low wash of waves along the shore carried through the gaps in the timbers and marked the time as the hall quieted. You thought of the path down to the water, and the way the longship would feel under your hands when you lifted. Leif closed his eyes and said you should wake him at midnight so he could take a turn watching the fire, and you agreed. You turned the sea axe once in its sheath to be sure it sat easy, and you touched the pouch where your small coin lay secure. The elder's staff leaned by the post as a sign that the oath stood, and you let that simple sign settle your thoughts. Leif's breathing went slow, and even while you lay back and counted the tasks in the order you would meet them, you rested in that order and felt the night ease by, ready to stand at grey dawn with Leif and bring the longship down to the sea. Chapter 2. Launch at first light. You stepped out from the hall with Leif at your side, and the yard lay quiet. The others waited by the sheds, and you joined them without fuss. Captain Gunnar stood with his cloak close and looked toward the path. He said little, and Leif answered with a nod. You understood. You all walked to the boathouse and set your hands to the hull. At grey dawn, you and Leif hauled the longship to the sea with the crew, and the skids took the weight. The men leaned to the task, and you matched your pace to theirs. Leif kept your left shoulder clear, and you kept his right side clear. Gunnar watched the line of men and moved along the side with a steady step. You kept your breath even and saved talk for later. By the shingle at the village shore that morning, the path narrowed and the ground flattened. We kept it simple, as our people did with such work. Torfi, the steersman, crouched to check the keel blocks. Leif shifted the bow line to you, and you wrapped it twice around your hand. 2 men fetched sand from the bank and spread it under the first roller. Captain Gunnar set the men in pairs and named who pushed and who guided. He placed you and Leif near the bow where the hull narrowed. Torfi marked the path to the water with his boot and pointed to a clear run. The shore smelled of wet kelp and the tang sat low in the air. You kept your mind on the rope and on Leif's pace as the word passed down the line. When the rollers were set, Gunnar raised his hand and spoke the order of work. He matched the strongest men to the heavy lift, and he held back an old hand to watch the keel. You took your place as named, and Leif kept to your right as planned. The captain set the order, and the steersman set the prow, and the crew knew the meaning of each small word. Torfi gave the bow a narrow aim down the path, and checked the lines twice. 2 men fenced off the sides with shields so the hull would not slip wide. The keel grated across the first roller with a long scrape that stayed even from end to end. The weight changed, and you shifted a step when Leif shifted. Gunnar moved along the starboard side and kept the count, a steady pace. You all stayed in line while Torfi called for the next lift near the second roller. The hull reached the last roller, and the waterline stood a short way ahead. Torfi set the prow true and told the bowman to hold while the stern swung. Gunnar pointed 2 men to the stern post, and they eased the tail around without fuss. You carried the bowline with Leif and stepped light over the stones. At his word, the crew gave the last shove, and the longship slid forward to the edge. You and Leif pushed off at the shingle, and the craft lifted free of the land. The men nearest you clambered aboard in the order that had been set, and you followed their sequence. Leif steadied the gunwale with a hand, and you took his grip with yours as you boarded. As the ship moved out, you tasted salt on your lips, a small sting that told you the day had begun. Torfi settled at the steering oar, while Gunnar named the bow and stern crews by the benches. The order of the launch held the crew steady, and it kept small mistakes from growing into trouble. Gunnar had set the pairs with care, and Torfi had kept the line clean. You kept to your place, and Leif kept to his, and the ship answered the work given to it. The men who ran the rollers came aboard last, and they took the spare oars as planned. It may not have seemed like much then, but it mattered later, because quiet habits made hard days easier. Gamara looked along the benches and nodded, and Torfi eased the long blade a touch to find the first path. The headland drew back into a thin shape behind you, while the bow turned to deeper water. You settled your cloak and checked your belt knife without thinking of it. Leif gave a brief nod, and you returned it. The lads nearest the mast waited for the word about the sail, and the older men kept them patient with a few plain lines of talk. The benches filled as planned, and you found your place with Leif at your elbow. Gunnar kept his place near the mast and kept his manner plain and brief. Torfi faced the low swell and kept the steering oar firm. You set your hands to the loom of the oar and checked that the leather wrap sat right. Leif checked along the rank to see that the pins were clear, and he nodded when he was sure. The feel of the worn wood under your palms told you the next part of the work would be steady. You turned your thoughts once toward the village, and then back to the deck where your duty sat. It was a plain start to a longer stretch, and the crew seemed ready for the hours that would follow. We keep the pace steady here, and we let the sea set the measure while men keep time to it. You drew a slow breath and waited for Gunnar to call the first pull that would carry you into the days under sail and oar. Chapter 3. Days under sail and oar. The shore lay behind you now, as the longship rose and settled, and you found your place beside Leif without fuss. Leif sat at the oar just ahead of you, and he glanced back once to see that your blade bit clean. You kept your cloak folded and tucked, and you checked the thong at the thole so it would not chafe and split. The captain moved along the midships planks with a quiet word for each pair, and he looked at hands as much as faces. You watched the steersman settle his weight near the steering oar, and you watched his eyes rather than his mouth, since the wind stole some words. The mast and yard held firm, and the sail bellied well enough when the breeze took it. You kept your seeps out of the way, and you kept the strap from snagging on the bench and the oar loom. Leif gave a small nod when your strokes matched his, and you felt the old rhythm return to your shoulders. The men aft checked the bailers and the buckets, and the men forward shifted chests so the trim stayed right for the wind. You felt the wet chill on your knuckles when a small spray lifted over the gunwale and touched your skin. By the second day at sea, far off any cliff or headland, the crew settled into the pace of open water. You and Leif rose when your watch came due, and you lay near the mast when it ended. The captain set the order for sleep and guard, and the steersman kept the course by sun and by the look of the swell. You stowed your spare tunic in a corner under the thwart, and kept your wool dry as you could. Leif shared a corner of his blanket once when the wind turned sharp, and you gave him a strip of leather for his raw palm in return. The older man named Gunnar sat near the bailers and told a low story between chores, and his voice kept minds from wandering too far. You kept your mind on little things such as knots and pegs, and you kept your mouth shut unless there was work to pass along. The oar crews shifted benches so no one arm carried the worst of it, and the bowmen watched for driftwood or a change in the swell. You heard the low hiss of water running along the planks as the keel cut a steady line. We keep the pace steady here, not fast, and it served you and Leif well. Food came out of bags and chests in the same plain way each day, and you did not waste time over it. You bit dried fish until your jaw ached a bit, and you softened hard bread with a mouthful of water when the crust set like horn. Leif handed you a spare strip of fish when your own bag came up light, and you gave him a sliver of cheese you had saved from home. Between turns at the oar, you pulled out your torn wool mitten, and you set a bone needle through it with clean small stitches. The captain paused and checked your seam with a thumb, and he said nothing because the work looked sound. You moved then to the lashings at the thwarts, and you ran fingers along each knot and thong until each one sat snug. Leif leaned over to feel a loose twist near his bench, and you tightened it with a short pull and a half hitch. The steersman kept his eye forward while you made those rounds, and he nodded once so you knew your checks were seen. The rigging glistened where pitch had been laid heavy, and you smelled the tar from the lines above your head. It may not have seemed like much then, but it mattered later. Wind failed at times, and the sail went slack, and the captain called for oars in easy order. You and Leif set your blades together, and the bowman in front gave a soft count, so the looms rose and fell in time. The steersman called the heading and lifted his hand when he wanted a longer pull, and he dropped it when he wanted short strokes through a patch of chop. Hands burned a little at first and then settled into the work, and you wrapped a strip of wool around the loom where it rubbed worst. Leif grunted once in a while, and he kept his breath even so he did not waste himself. The men aft bailed where seep came through the seams, and a pair forward set the sail tight so it would not snap and slap. The captain moved the heavier backs to the middle benches when the pull grew hard, and he let the smaller men take the bow seats where the lift felt lighter. You watched for drift while you rowed, and you watched for a change in the set of the waves that might tell of a shoal. When the wind returned, the men eased the oars in, and you shipped yours clean and laid it quiet along the bench. You heard the tap of the beater on a plank to mark the turn when the stroke changed, and you kept to it without fuss. The days under sail and oar made a crew out of hands that had only shared a hearth and a beach, and you felt it settle in your bones. You learned the way Leif quickened a little at the end of a pull, and Leif learned that you steadied the loom when the bow rose. The captain learned who could fix a thong with one glance and who needed a word, and the steersman learned who could be trusted near the gear in a pinch. You ate the same plain food and drank the same thin water, and no one made much of it, because there was work ahead. You kept mending small things and kept the lashings tight, and you set your mind to tasks rather than thoughts that ran off. It may not have seemed like much then, but it mattered later when a quiet landing would ask for silence and order. Leif said as much when he checked his shield rim and then set it aside, and you nodded because you felt the truth of it. The men forward watched the sky for a shift, and they passed the word aft without fuss when the color of the clouds grew thin. You looked ahead at dawn and saw a pale path of light along the water, and you took that as a good sign of steadier weather. A low coast waited somewhere beyond that rim, and the days of steady work would carry you there without waste. At night you lay with your cloak over your shoulders and your sea axe near your hip, and you listened to the ship speak in the short way a good hull speaks. Leif lay close enough that a hand could reach across, and you knew his breath had steadied with the day's work. The captain set a small watch, and you took a turn near the mast to be ready when wind or weather shifted. The steersman kept his seat, even when others changed, and you learned to trust his quiet more than a loud promise. You thought of the oath at the hearth and the shares named, and you let the thought pass because thinking would not add a mile. You folded your mitten and set it by your chest when the mending held, and you checked the thongs at the thwarts without waking anyone. Leif smiled in the dark when he felt the ship run a little freer, and you smiled back though you knew he could not see it. The oars lay quiet along the benches, and the sail drew when the breeze gave it just enough. You felt the cool night air on your cheek as you turned your head, and you let your eyes close because tomorrow would ask for the same steady care. The quiet shoreline would meet you in its own time, and you and Leif would be ready to lower the sail and set the gear as the captain planned. Chapter 4. The Quiet Shoreline. You came off the long night watch with your eyes stinging a little and your hands steady on the gunwale, and there the coast sat low and pale ahead. Leif stood beside you with his shoulders set, and you nodded to him without a word. The captain lifted one arm and made a small turn of the wrist, and the steersman eased the rudder just so. You and Leif moved to the halyard and let the sail down soft, hand over hand, the canvas folding quiet. The yard came to rest, and you lashed it where the captain had shown, with the gear tucked neat under the thwarts. Leif checked the bits and coils, and you checked the spare oarlocks, each task small, each one known. The captain spoke low and plain, naming a cove and a path, and the work of the first 6 ashore. You and Leif listened, and kept your faces straight, taking the words and laying them in order in your heads. You blackened the bright faces of your round shields with soot from a small pot, and Leif did the same, rubbing until the wood looked dull. You felt the chill of morning mist on your cheeks, and let it settle there as you worked. Near dawn, with the shoreline no more than a ridge of scrub and a dim line of dunes, the longship glided under shortened stroke. The steersman kept her belly to the swells and watched the pale notch that marked the creek mouth, and the captain nodded once. You crouched and slid your pack forward, and Leif shifted the spare spear shafts, keeping the iron under wraps. Each man kept his own place, and each man watched another's habit, because that was how a crew moved without fuss. You raised your spear and twisted the head to feel if the tang sat right, and Leif gave the socket a tap with the back of his knife. The captain named who would stand by the bow and who would mind the rope basket, and he named you and Leif to the first shore party. You accepted it with a small breath and a look to Leif, and Leif showed the corner of a smile that did not last. The plan was not heavy with talk, and it did not need to be. Simple words carried far enough. You heard the slow pulse of surf as it rolled and eased on the outer bar, and you counted it without thinking. You took your seeps from the belt and ran a thumb along the spine, and Leif folded a strip of cloth around his so it would not catch your clothes. The captain walked the length of the deck and put a hand on each man's shoulder, and he stopped at you and told you to mind the ditch beyond the gate, if there was one. You and Leif shared a mouthful of water from a skin and passed it back to the rope keeper. The steersman murmured to the bowman, a fellow named Arn, and Arn nodded and lifted the lead line in easy loops. You worked a thin thong through the grip of your shield and cinched it to fit your hand a little tighter, and Leif used a new knot he had learned from the sailmaker. The anchor stone was already slung so it could be jettisoned fast, and the oar blades were bound in rags for silence. You shifted your wool cloak so it would stay out of your legs, and Leif tucked his under the strap so it could not flap. The captain held up 3 fingers, and then 2, telling how many would stay with the ship at first, and you nodded along. You looked over the men you knew, calling each by name in your mind, and you made a small space for the unknown that waited beyond the reeds. The soot on your shield made a thin smear on your thumb, and you wiped it on your tunic with care. The steersman brought her along the lee of a spit, and the captain signalled the bow to sound the depth, and Arn cast and called the measure in a low voice. You and Leif rose a little as the boat turned and settled, and the oars moved in a slow, even pull. A patch of reeds slid past, and the low bank opened to a narrow tongue of sand where a man could step down without a splash up the shin. The captain's hand went out flat, and that meant steady and keep it easy, so you kept it easy, and Leif matched you. The prow kissed the sand, and you and Arn stepped together to catch the bow rope, while the steersman held her just off the ground. 4 men went over the side and kept their weight even so she would not yaw, and you passed the rope down to Leif. The chest with rope and spare pegs came next, and then the coil of line with the grapnel that might find a log if needed. The captain came ashore last of the first 6, and he pointed with 2 fingers toward the darker run of grass that marked a path. You and Leif settled shields on your forearms and shifted spears to the walk, each move the same as you had done on drill days. The keel made a low scrape against sand as the next man eased the stern around, and that told you the tide still had room to fall. You looked back once and saw the ship riding easy with her mast down, and you placed that picture in your head to steady the rest of the work. Leif stood to your left because that was where he always stood, and the captain took the middle, and Arn watched the right. The soot on the shields mattered because a bright bit could catch a stray light through brush, and you had learned that from men older than you. Tight spearheads mattered because a loose one could turn a good thrust into a clumsy shove, and Leif had fixed one like that for a cousin back home. The order mattered because if each man knew his place, he did not need to look for it when he should be watching the ground. It may not have seemed like much then, but it mattered later, when feet moved without talk and hands found the right work. You and Leif checked the leather of your shoe ties and pulled them once more each, quiet and steady. The captain knelt and traced a shallow line in the sand to show the turn you would take at the field edge, and you memorized it. Arn pointed to a clump of elder bushes that would mark the hedge, and you marked that too. You felt the weight of the spear settle into your grip in a way that told you it would not twist. You set off from the strand with Leif at your shoulder, and the captain leading, and each man took the same length of step so the line stayed straight. The steersman's voice was behind you now, small and calm as he set the ship detail, and you let it fade. The path gave you the ground you needed, and the reeds closed off the ship from sight, and the crew's small ship noises fell away. You and Leif kept your heads low but not hunched, and you let your breath come easy, steadying it to the walk. We keep the pace steady here, not fast and not slow, because steady covers more ground than hurry with fewer mistakes. The elders' warnings from home sat in your mind like stones laid on a wall, and you touched each one by name. The captain said you would skirt the farm if the gate looked watched, and Arn would mark the byre if it lay open. You and Leif kept your ears to your own steps and to the line ahead, and you counted the paces the captain had set. There was time enough to think of what came next, and there was no need to say much. A pale band of light grew along the water's edge behind you as the morning lifted. Chapter 5. The farmstead approach. You stepped off the sand and into the low brush with Leif beside you, moving without hurry. Asgrim moved ahead a little, and Torvald and Kettle kept to the right under the hedge, each holding to his place. You kept the elder's warnings in mind, and held your spear in your left and your round shield near your ribs, the way you had drilled. Leif touched the rim of his shield once, and he nodded toward the faint line of a path, keeping his gaze low. You kept your steps slow and set each foot where the ground seemed firm, testing each spot before you put weight on it. Asgrim signaled a halt with 2 fingers, and he crouched to peer through the branches, careful not to stir them. You breathed steady and kept the butt of your spear from clicking against stone, holding the shaft close. Leif kept his gaze on the gaps, and he shifted his seep so it would not knock against the boss, as you had reminded each other. You felt wet grass chill your ankles as you brushed past a clump by the ditch, a small bite that woke your legs. Torvald glanced back, and Kettle pointed to a post that marked the start of a farm lane, the first sign you had hoped to see. It was still early in the low country beyond the dunes, and the sun sat somewhere behind a pale sky, soft and hidden. You followed the hedge line toward a small farm that lay a little inland from the shore, keeping the sea at your back. Leif kept count under his breath, and he marked the distance with a tap on his belt every few dozen paces, steady as a metronome. The byre roof showed through the scrub, and the yard wall ran in a rough square around it, set with posts that leaned a little. Asgrim pointed with 2 short jabs, and Torvald nodded and set his shield at an angle, both men mindful of the gaps. You carried the elder's words with you, and they were simple ones about not rushing and not scattering, the kind that stayed in the head. Leif's eyes went to the far corner, where a gap in the wall showed a path toward the gate, and his chin tilted to mark it. You caught the smell of peat smoke from a turf fire, and it told you that someone kept the hearth going, slow and steady. Kettle brushed the bark of a bold tree as he passed, and he did not make any noise, careful of small sounds. It seemed simple, and simple was best, because plain steps often held firm when the rest grew tangled. You stopped in the shelter of a broken stone wall and checked the grip of your spear, pressing your palm to the wrap. Leif eased his strap and set his shield so that the rims would meet if you had to stand close, just as you had planned. You ran your hand along the ash shaft and felt the smooth, oiled wood where you had rubbed it on the voyage, a familiar surface. Asgrim adjusted his helm thong, and Torvald tested the edge of his seeks with his thumb, both small habits that made sense to you. You did not speak more than a word, and the word was only a name when someone drifted too far, so as not to clutter the air. Leif spoke your name once and touched your elbow, and you shifted to keep the hedge between you and the open, keeping the screen. You remembered the elder's warnings, and you pictured his hand flat as he showed how a line could hold or fail, a simple board on a table. Kettle carried the coil of cord that the captain had sent with you, and he wore it banded at his waist, ready for a door or a gate. You checked again that the iron nails on your shoes were not loose, and you moved your feet without scraping them, for steadiness mattered. Leif squinted toward the byre, and he made a small motion that meant it was time to go on, a cue you both understood. You eased along the hedge until the byre stood across a small strip of ground, and the farmstead sat quiet, with its corners plain to see. Leif saw the gate on the far side, and he moved his hand in a way that set the order for who would cross the open first, as the captain taught. You and Leif went together, and Asgrim would hang back 2 breaths before following, with Torvald and Kettle last, keeping the file clean. Leif stepped into the field and kept his shoulders low, and he set his feet without hurrying, a steady march in small measure. You held your shield near your thigh, so the boss would not show above the grass, and you counted your steps to keep them even, 10 then 10 again. Asgrim paused to watch the yard, and he waited for a hen to drift away from the gap in the wall, so no flutter would draw an eye. A lone crow lifted from the fence and hopped twice before it flew to a post, a black mark on the grey morning. Leif kept moving, and he slid behind a low woodpile that leaned against the wall near the byre, making himself small. You followed and took his place while he looked toward the house, and the 2 of you traded spots without a word, a move you had practiced. We kept the pace steady here, and it may sound slow when told, but it saved breath and kept hands sure, which was the point. You could tell that the slow crossing and the care with hands and feet kept the line of you together, which mattered for what came. Leif stayed within reach, and his nearness made your own steps more certain, like a stake set true in the ground. You kept the elder's warnings as a measure, and the measure felt plain and useful in that small field, exactly as he had meant. Asgrim brought Torvald and Kettle up to the wall, and none of them had to hurry to catch up, because the tempo never broke. You checked your spear point once more against the rim of the shield, and it sat where it should sit, neither too high nor low. Leif breathed through his nose and let the breath out slowly, and you matched him so that your chests rose at the same time, a quiet rhythm. You looked again toward the gate and noted how the ditch ran near it, and you marked it in your head for the next part, a simple hazard. Leif lifted 2 fingers to show that the next move would bring you to the yard corner, and you watched his knuckles so you would not miss it, as always. You understood that this small work mattered because the next steps would be closer to where men might be, and it set your mind to plain duty, without heat. It may not have seemed like much then, but it mattered later, and the care you kept here would carry through the short clash to come, as steady as breath. You felt the strap of your shield press a little into the top of your shoulder, and you shifted it once to settle the weight, letting it sit right. Leif set his mouth in a straight line that you knew, and he moved 1 step so that your shields would touch if they had to, simple and sure. You fixed your eyes on the yard angle and the way the gate stood a little off true, and you traced the path that led from it toward the lane, counting in your head. Asgrim leaned in at your back and spoke a single word to say he was there, and Torvald and Kettle made the space behind him firm, tightening the shape. You kept your seeps on your belt where it belonged, and you tightened your fingers on the spear until the grip settled, so there would be no slip. Leif turned his head just enough that you could see his eye, and he blinked once to say he was ready, as calm as he could be. You let your mind grow quiet, and fixed it on the simple next thing, which was to move to the corner and set the line, keeping the drill alive. Leif gave a small tilt of his head, and you took that moment to picture the drill the captain had set for such a gate, an easy pattern to follow. You did not feel hurry, and the calm held as you started to move, knowing that the yard and the gate would ask for quick, short steps, no more and no less. In that still breath between hedge and wall, you went forward with Leif and the others, and the farmstead waited ahead for the short work that would follow, steady as a task. Chapter 6. Short Clash by the Gate. The watchman broke from the yard and ran toward the gate as you lifted your shield and came up beside Leif. The captain held his hand flat, and you and Leif took the small steps he wanted. You kept the spear point straight out, just over the rim, and you watched the posts of the gate line up with your path. Leif held his shield to your right, and the edge of his board overlapped yours the way you had practiced. The captain said to hold tight and to watch the ditch, and you marked the shallow dip that ran before the fence. A man in a short cloak waved a stick, and another held a hatchet, and both slowed when they saw the line settle. Leif breathed slow, and you matched him, and you judged the reach from your point to their steps. You kept your knees bent and your body behind the board, and you eased forward in time with the men on your left. The captain set the pace, and you and Leif moved together. You heard their feet beat the hard path as the space closed. At the farm gate that morning, the crew held the front 2 ranks, and the ditch ran like a shallow cut before you. The fence posts stood close, and the crossbar hung by a loop of rope, and the yard showed a churn and a trough. The captain placed Asger and Horolf to your left, and he kept Leif and you where he wanted the push to start. A boy in a blue cap slipped behind the byre, and an older man came out with a long rake, and he stopped when the line held. You kept the spear at chest height, and Leif kept his lower, and the tips made a narrow path. The captain gave the same short instructions you had learned on the deck, about small steps and quiet hands. You and Leif breathed and counted without sound, and you kept the point steady as the first man reached the ditch. The men ahead of the yard turned to someone inside, and you watched hands pull on the loop at the bar. The plank sagged and the gate shifted, and you set your feet on even ground. The smell of damp straw drifted from the byre and sat in your nose. You had trained for this on many mornings when the wind held you off some coast, and the captain had made you practice shield and spear in a tight file. Leif liked to set his left foot a finger ahead of yours, and he said it helped him keep the board from tipping when the first press came. Asger carried a short spear and a sakes at his belt, and he always checked your elbow before a push, and you did the same for him. The old man from the village had told the elder that watchmen at small steadings often came on fast and then backed away, and you kept that in mind now. You thought of the shares named in the hall, and you kept your mind on your place in the rank because the order kept men safe. Leif nodded once to mark the next step, and his eyes fixed on the latch pin. The captain kept his hand low and flat as he moved along the side of the file, and you followed that line. It may not have seemed like much then, but it mattered later, because the steady start led to a short finish. Sweat ran down your neck under the wool and made the collar cling. Leif shifted his grip, and you shifted yours, and the two of you matched the angle like you had done on the ship. The first watchman reached the ditch and tried to hop it, and his foot slipped on the far edge, and he came up short with the hatchet high. You stepped to the mark, set your board to his, and kept your spear point straight at his chest without pushing past the rim. Leif took your right and angled his board, and Asger touched his rim to your left, and the three boards made a small wall. The captain signaled for the short shove, and you gave it with your shoulder, and took back your step to keep the line. The man stumbled and backed toward the bar, and a second man came around with a rake and reached at the tips. You kept the spear level and used the bind you had learned, so the rake slid away and the point stayed clear. Leif thrust low to make space, and you raised your point and held, and the yardmen started to lose the pace. One of your men put his foot in the ditch and went down on a knee, and Asger pulled him up by the strap while you held still. The dull knock of wood on wood ran along the file as shields met and parted in short beats. You stayed aware of the gate hinge and the board at your feet, and you kept the rank tidy while the men from the yard let go their hold. It ended as a short press, not a long fight, and you and Leif knew that the line had done what the captain meant it to do. The watchman gave ground to the yard, and they pulled the bar back inside, and they stayed there while you steadied the point and waited. Leif glanced at you and you nodded, and the captain counted the men in the front rank and nothing had gone loose. Asger checked the ditch again, and he pointed to a narrow place where a cart had crossed, and the line shifted to that spot. You kept the boards tight as the file edged past the gate, and you stepped over a broken pail and kept the point down. The captain set you and Leif to hold the middle while others gathered what lay in sight. You marked the hedges in your mind, because the return to the strand would need the same calm pace. It seemed plain and small, but it mattered, since a quiet break from a yard kept a crew safe for the walk back. A thin breeze touched your cheek and cooled the skin. Leif rolled his shoulder, and you rolled yours, and the two of you set your grips again for the move to the beach. You left the gate in order, and the file turned along the hedge, and Leif kept step with you as the captain set the path to the shore. Asger walked behind and watched the rear, and a pair from the other crew took the side, and the ground showed the same small dips you had marked on the way in. You kept the spear low and the board up, and you thought of the ship and the men who would be at the strand waiting for the load. Leif said the line had held well, and you shared the same plain thought and let it sit. The captain kept you moving toward the surf, and he set 2 men to bring the chest, and you planned the line to the water. It may have seemed like a small thing from far off, but it gave the crew a clean space to leave, and the steersman would like that. You made a quick count, and you came up even with what you started, and Leif made the same count and nodded once. The men at the ship would see the line coming and set their boards, and the beach would be a place to hold until the push to sea. Gulls called over the sand, and the sound carried from the strand. You kept your hands steady and your mind on the beach, and the next work waited there, simple and clear. Chapter 7. Holding the strand. While the ship took its load, you came off the path with Leif at your side, the chest between you and the rope coil tucked under your arm. He set the box down by a drifted log, and you slid your shield into place and raised it to your shoulder. The captain stood by the prow and pointed men to their places, and you watched his hand move with steady signs. Leif nodded once and moved to your left so your edges overlapped, and you kept your eyes on the way through the grass. The steersman stood back near the stern post and measured the waterline with a glance, and he held his voice for later. A pair of young men trotted in with a sack and passed behind you, and another pair carried a low stool for the captain. You said nothing and counted your breathing while Leif shifted his feet in the sand. The men at the keel worked in rhythm as they cleared seaweed from the runners and set small rollers in place. You kept your weight on the back foot and tilted the rim just so, like the captain had taught you in drills. You felt the rough rim of the shield on your palm, and you held it there without fuss. By late morning, the strand lay open in a pale light, and the tide still leaned our way for a short while. You stood where the dunes sloped down, and Leif stood a step behind you to watch a second angle. The captain counted heads and spoke each name once, and men answered with a word or a lift of the chin. The steersman checked a mark on a rock, and then looked to the horizon, as if it were a line on a board. You saw the path cut between two bushes and kept that place at the center of your view. Leif shifted his grip on the spear and cleared his throat once to let you know he was set. The pair at the mast step raised the spar out of the way, and two others carried buckets to scoop sand from under the keel. A small boy from the farm peered from the brush and then slipped away, and you did not move an inch. The wind cooled your face, and you let the steadiness of it set your pace. It may not have seemed like much then, but it mattered later. You watched while two men stacked shields along the gunwale, and you kept the top of yours in the same line. Leif checked the chest lid and made sure the peg held. Then he stepped back to your elbow again. The captain sent 3 men to bring the second coil, and he waved at you to hold your place and keep the front tight. You lowered your shield just a finger's width, and you took the rope from under your arm and set it across your shoulder. Leif said your name in a low voice and told you that the path was clear for the moment, and you said his name back so he knew you heard. The men at the midship thwarts tied short lashings to keep loads from sliding, and the thumps came slow, and even though you marked them only by sight, you put the rope down beside your foot so the loop would not drag, and you kept your head still as the captain crossed in front of you. The steersman walked once around the stern as if he were counting steps, and then he stopped with his hand on the steering oar. You picked up the rope again and checked the first knot by feel, the same square knot you had tied all winter on smaller bundles. The rope's fibers scratched your wrist as you snugged the lay, and you eased your hand away so you would not flinch later. We keep the pace steady here, and that is how a crew stayed whole. A handful of men from the fields showed at the far end of the strand and stopped when they saw the line, and you watched them without lifting your chin. Leif adjusted the rim of his shield so it just covered the gap at your knee, and he kept his spear low over the sand. The captain raised his hand and made a small turn of the wrist, and 2 men stepped out to your right to cover a stack of sacks. The men on the far side shifted and looked back over their shoulders as if someone behind them had called them, and one of them raised an arm and lowered it again. You did not move to chase or to invite, and you rested the point of your spear on the sand between shifts. The steersman kept his silence, and he stood with one foot on the roller and one on the sand. A faint bell carried from inland and then faded, and you let the sound pass by like a bird that did not land. Leif breathed slow and steady, and you matched him without looking his way. The 2 youngest in your crew hauled a basket of ironwork past your heels, and then took their places behind you for a moment. You tilted the shield to catch more of the path and less of the open strand, and the captain gave a small nod that showed he liked what he saw. The line held long enough for the men to finish the last weight, and that was the point of it, plain and simple. You gave time for the chests to be set low, and for the lighter goods to go high, and you kept the path watched so no one rushed the work. Leif kept the left side locked so the gap to the dune stayed closed, and he did it without strain. The captain used the steady minutes to leave the mast clear, and he set the yard ready for a quick rise once the water took the hull. The steersman set the steering oar where he wanted it for the first pull, and he checked the thole pins by habit. You stood like a door in a frame while the ship got its balance back, and that meant fewer hard strokes later. It gave the crew a chance to breathe, and it kept the push clean when it came. You took a pull from the water skin and handed it to Leif, and he nodded once and passed it along to the next man. The water tasted flat, and it sat well in your mouth. It may have looked like a quiet spell to someone new, but it set up the next reach. When the last load went in, the captain came to your side and put his hand on your shoulder, and then he went to the steersman with a short word. You raised the shield a little higher and drew a slow breath, and you eased your spear point up so it would not catch the sand at the start. Leif glanced once at your boots and then at the rollers, and you knew he wanted the first steps even and firm. The steersman lifted his hand halfway and held it there, and the crew near the keel bent their knees as one. You kept your eyes on the path for one more count, and you weighed the quiet by how still the dune grass held. The captain waited for the steersman to set the moment, and he kept every face on him with just a look. You let the shield tilt from guard to carry, and you shifted your stance carefully so your first stride would not slip. Leif smiled without showing teeth, and he set his hand to the gunwale to share the lift at the right time. Cold damp pressed through your boot soles, and you knew the sand would give but not too much. You all stood ready to push when the steersman called, and the ship waited for the pull that would take her back to water. Chapter 8. Pulling away to sea. The bow slid free as the line came in from the strand, and you pushed with your shoulder beside Leif. The steersman called the beat in a plain count, and the captain held his eye on the spit that guarded the cove. You set your oar into the water, and Leif matched your stroke on the next thwart. The crew fell into the count, and the longship gathered way one body length at a time. The sail still lay in its brail, while the steersman wanted clear water, and the captain nodded at his caution. You kept your breath steady and your back straight, and Leif set his jaw and paced you. The beat rose a notch as the tide turned under the keel, and the bow eased toward the channel. You ate a few spoonfuls of porridge from a wooden bowl between strokes, and you did not spill more than a smear. The steersman lifted a hand when he wanted a short pull, and the crew answered with a clean swing. You heard the creak of the oarlocks, and Leif heard it too. By mid-morning you were past the headland and clear of the shoals off the coast. The steersman gave the word, and the captain signaled the mast crew, and the sail went up hand over hand on the halyard. You felt the steady pull through the loom of your oar as the square sail took the wind, and Leif eased his stroke to match the change. The beat dropped to an easy count, and the steersman trimmed the sheet with 2 men on the line. The shoreline grew small, and the captain kept the prow a little off the wind for a kinder run. Leif asked for the bailer and passed it back without fuss, and you shifted your feet on the plank for a fresh stance. The steersman set a new count and pointed at the next mark, and the crew answered without talk. The mast stay held tight, and the captain checked the lashings at the partners. Leif glanced at you and gave a small nod that meant keep steady, and you answered with another measured pull. It may not have seemed like much then, but it mattered later. The rowing settled into a work pace, and you counted under your breath while Leif counted with you. The steersman kept the beat even, and the captain moved along the thwarts to look at hands and faces. You ate porridge from a wooden bowl between strokes, and the spoon came back to you from Leif in a quick pass. The bowl was warm in your hands, and you held it low so it would not tip as the ship moved. Leif checked the chest lashings with his foot and gave a quick tug to a loose turn, and you nodded to show you would finish it at the next rest. The steersman sent 2 men forward to make fast the spare oars, and the captain told off a pair for the bailer and the tar pot. You moved the knot through your fingers until it sat right, and Leif slid the coil back under the thwart where it would not wander. The crew passed the water skin by order, and the steersman reminded all to keep the count steady. You shifted places with a younger man for a dozen pulls, and Leif made the same trade to keep the rhythm smooth. It was simple work and close work, and you kept your mind on the line and the pull. When the longship reached open water, the captain ordered the oars into half strokes, and the steersman trimmed the sail a finger width at a time. You kept your blade clear on the return, and let the wind do more of the work, and Leif watched the steersman's hand for each small change. The line on the sheet moved by fits as 2 men paid it out, and the captain checked the set from the prow. You shifted forward on the bench to ease your back, and Leif loosened the tie on his cloak so his arms would not bind. The steersman counted slower and stretched the numbers, and the crew followed the count without stray pulls. Aft, the steersman kept his eye on the wake, and the captain gave him a nod that meant keep this course. A shore boat crossed the water for a while, and then turned toward a creek, and you kept your stroke even until it was gone. The rigging hummed when the gusts came, and the mast held without complaint. You set your oar inside the boat when the captain called an oars up, and Leif slid his blade in alongside yours. The longship kept her pace with the sail alone, and the steersman made a small change that brought the prow off the swell. The pull away from the coast came down to order, and you kept to it because the captain had set it plain. Leif kept you paced and you kept him paced, and the steersman's count held your arms in time with the rest. The small things added up, and the chest lashings, the tide coils, the halyard turns, and the bailer work all kept the ship sound. You ate what you had when you could and did not waste, and the captain trusted you to keep your place without prodding. The longship put sea between you and the landing, and the steersman chose water that gave you steady way without fight. The low slap of water on the planks went with you, and Leif made a simple joke that drew a few smiles and then quiet again. It mattered because the tide and the wind were with you only so long, and the plan was to ride both while they favored you. You thought of the elders' talk about shares and duties, and the captain would speak on it again once the harbor came near. Leif tapped the chest with his foot when he passed to show it rode safe, and you checked the rope ends once more. You kept the count and saved your strength for the hours ahead, and the ship held on her heading. In the quiet stretch that followed, you felt the work settle into you, and the captain's voice came now and then to adjust the plan by a word. Leif kept near you on the bench, and the steersman kept his hand light on the tiller as the sail did its work. You held the oar when your turn came, and rested it when told, and the crew moved through the same simple pattern without talk. The slow ache in your shoulders told you the day had been full, and you knew there was still distance to make before the harbour that waited. Leif rubbed his palm on his tunic and grinned in the small way he had, and you gave him a nod that said it was all right. The captain walked aft and forward and checked everything that could loosen or chafe, and the steersman marked the course by the marks he kept in his head. You thought of the elder who would stand by the shore and count the shields when you returned, and you kept your mind on the simple next pull. Leif kept the bowl and spoon tucked under the thwart against the next meal, and you tucked the rope ends in the same place. It would be days yet, but you pictured the harbour and the place on the beach where the keel would touch, and you pictured the sharing that would follow. The ship held her course without fuss, and you let the steady work carry you into the long water ahead. Chapter 9. Sharing and Quiet. Thanks. The headland opened, and the home water lay ahead, and you and Leif kept your oar steady. The steersman lifted his hand, and the captain gave the word to bear in. The sail came down clean, and the crew settled to the last strokes with easy backs. Leif looked across the benches, and you nodded to him, simple and plain after the long run. The shore marks that you both knew sat where they should, and the tide ran low as planned. The bowmen held their poles at the ready, and the stern crew watched the stones. The keels slid across the shallows, and men rose together to catch the sides. You stepped from your thwart and moved to the rail, and Leif took the line without talk. The ship eased onto the strand where the path climbed to the sheds, and the captain called for care with the ribs. You heard the scrape of the keel on gravel, and the sound told you that the journey had ended. By late afternoon in the home harbour, you and Leif dragged the ship above the tide and set the mast down. The steersman oversaw the props, and the captain watched the spar come clear of its step. You eased the sail into its cover and passed it to Arn, and Leif tied off the yard as told. The elder walked from the path with two others, and he raised a hand but said little yet. Old Sigrid counted the thole pins, and the boys from the sheds stood quiet by the skids. You kept to the work and minded the order, because neat work here saved work later. Leif checked the lashings at the stem, and you freed the lower shrouds from their cleats. The crew set the oars into the racks, and the bailer went to the shed under the eaves. The steersman took a last look along the planking, and the elder nodded as if the trimming pleased him. You felt the cool damp of the beach stones through the soles as you shifted your weight. With the hull braced, you and Leif lifted the chests to the green and set them in a clean line. The captain told Bjorn to bring the tally staff, and the steersman fetched the small scale. You rolled the rope coils and put them by the mast heel, and Leif stacked the round shields by colour. Arn and Sigrid cleared a space for the piles, and Kari laid a cloth for the silver. The elder stood with the captain and said nothing, and his two helpers held wax tablets. You cleaned the sand from the chestboards with your hand, and Leif thumbed the corners to check for cracks. The wide iron nails were set aside for the smith, and the poor knives were thrown into a bin for sharpening. We keep the pace steady here, because straight habits in small things kept quarrels short. You coiled your own line and felt the twist of the hemp in your palm, and Leif smiled at the familiar work. The steersman walked each pile with the captain and recited the bits, and the elder marked each word. The crew stood easy but alert, because each man knew the order mattered in the sharing. When the captain was ready, he marked out the common share, and the elder touched the staff to show assent. The crewmen who had taken the first risk received their due first, and then the rest of the order followed. You stood as names were called, and Leif's name came near yours as it had on other years. The captain gave sums to the ship, to the men, and to the shore, and the steersman kept each count simple. You took your small portion when it came, and held it plain in your hand, and Leif did the same, and tucked his into a pouch. Old Sigrid set aside a piece for the poor box, and the elder nodded as if that too had been in his mind. When the piles were done, you walked with Leif to the altar post by the shed, and you both laid a coin and spoke thanks as you had been taught. The elder stood close enough to hear, and the captain stood beyond him and waited without hurry. It may not have seemed like much then, but it set the day in proper shape for each of you. A kettle hung by the cook fire near the green, and you smelled hot broth from the rim. The crew eased a little at that smell, and the boys from the sheds brought bowls without being told. You and Leif stepped back to make room, and the steersman smiled as if he too felt the day loosen. You stood on the green and thought on the path that had led the crew here, and Leif stood with you without speaking. The oaths in winter had held firm, and the work in spring and summer had come to this small plain sharing. The elders' presence kept old rules close, and the captain's steady ways kept temper from rising. You counted your share again only to be sure, and you tucked one small piece away for a promise you had made at the hearth. Leif touched your elbow and pointed toward the lane where his people waited, and you nodded that you would not be long. It was simple, and that was the strength of it, because simple things could be kept through hard years. You felt the weight of the coin in your palm before you stowed it, and the feel fixed the day in your mind. The steersman spoke softly to Arn about the next tide, and the crew joked a little now that the tallies were done. We do not hurry in such hours, because calm steps made the change from sea to shore gentle. The kettle still hung over the low fire on the edge of the green, and old Sigrid kept an eye on the line for bowls. You and Leif waited your turn and stayed nearby, in case the elder had a last word. In the end, the elder spoke a short blessing and stepped away, and the captain clapped the steersman on the shoulder as men began to drift. You and Leif took your bowls and sat on a timber by the skids, and the cook handed a heel of bread to go with it. You held the bowls as the light lowered, and you ate slowly because there was no more hurry. You tasted the broth and found it plain and good, and Leif grinned with his mouth full at the simple comfort. The ship lay quiet above the tide with her mast lashed down, and the oars stood neat in their rack like fence pickets. You folded your cloak and tucked your share deep in your belt, and Leif tied his pouch and checked the knot twice. The steersman spoke of mending a plank tomorrow, and the captain said he would see the elder before the sun was high. You thought of your boots and the axe that would need oil, and Leif spoke of his mother and the fence that wanted fixing. It was a small turning in the year, and it felt right to let it be small, so it would sit well in the mind. You finished the last of the bowl and stood with Leif, and both of you took a last moment with the ship that had carried you out and back. Then you started up the lane toward the houses, and the road home lay quiet and ready for winter talk. Chapter 10. Winter Rest and Memory. That evening, you carried your bundle from the shore and stepped back into your doorway, while Leif walked beside you. You slid the shield to the wall and set the spear behind the chest. Leif set his pack down and rubbed his sore forearm. You loosened the belt, eased the seeps from its sheath, and laid it on the bench. The captain's words about fair shares sat in your head as you unknotted the thong. Leif spoke quietly about his mother and the coin he hoped to bring her. You nodded and set your cloak aside for later work. The elder's face at the altar stayed with you, calm and steady in your thoughts. You stirred the coals and felt the steady warmth on your hands. Leif took the small chest you had carried and put it near the post. In the short days after your return, in your longhouse on the headland, you set about the slow work of putting things right. Leif came by afternoon and sat on the bench while you unwrapped the axe and wiped the haft. You pinched a rag with a bit of oil and worked the iron, moving steady so the edge did not catch. The steersman had once said that a clean edge gave a clean mind, and you remembered his plain way of saying it. Leif nodded as you pulled the whetstone across the blade in even strokes, and the stone made a soft scrape. You turned the axe and checked the bit for nicks, then worked the beard where rust liked to hide. The elder had praised careful hands more than loud boasting, and that stayed with you while you set the axe aside. You took the seeks and eased its edge true, thinking of the thongs you would mend on the sheath. Leif helped you roll the oiled cloth and tied it with a thin strip you had kept from the voyage. You stacked the tools back in the chest and closed the lid, then straightened with the job done. We keep the pace steady here, one small task then the next. You set your boots on your knees and cut new laces while Leif threaded a needle with flax. You worked an awl through the stiff leather and felt the small bite in your thumb as you pushed the stitch. Leif held the tongue straight and kept the holes lined so the seam would sit flat when you pulled it tight. You patched the heel where the pebbles had worn a groove, and you checked the sole for soft spots. The captain had talked of worn gear leading to slow feet, and you heard that lesson in your head as you tied the knot. Leif laughed a little at the crooked start, and you both started again with better care and smaller steps. You mended a strap on the cloak and set aside a spare lace in the pouch for the next time it failed. The elder passed by the doorway and greeted you both, and you stood to nod and show him the tools. You told a small piece of the voyage to the children who had wandered in, using plain words and leaving out boastful parts. Leif added how the line had held at the gate, and you kept it simple so the younger ones would not wake fearful. The next morning, you and Leif sat at the table and counted the silver, laying out coins so each family would have its fair part. You put your small share for the crew's rope fund to one side, remembering the captain's rule that a ship stayed sound when all paid in. Leif set aside his share for his mother and put 2 coins in a cloth for a neighbor who had mended thongs for him before the voyage. You made a small pile for the elder's winter store, not because he asked, but because he had stood long hours to bless the harbor. Leif pushed the last coin across the board, and the little clink of silver on wood marked the end of the count. You walked with Leif to his door and handed over the cloth, then turned back to your place to pack the chest for the season. The dried fish went in first, then a sack of barley, then a pouch with salt and a strip of goat cheese. You set the axe, the sea axe, and the whetstone in their corner, and you folded the cloak with its repaired strap on top. The steersman came by with word that the ship would be checked after the ice, and you told him you would bring your hands when needed. Leif said he would come too, and you both knew that shared work made future days go smoother. That night, you sat by the fire with Leif and spoke through the voyage in a slow, even run, not to stir pride, but to set it straight. You named the oath at the hearth, the push on the shingle, the beat at the oars, and the quiet shore where plans were made. Leif told how the captain kept the line steady, and how the steersman called the stroke without haste. You said how soot on the shields kept things plain, and how short steps kept men together at the gate. The elder listened and gave a short nod when you spoke of fair shares and the coin laid at the post. Leif looked down at his hands and said the work had been hard, and you agreed because hard work made the rest of winter sit easier. A faint thread of peat smoke drifted across the rafters while you both let the words settle in the order they belonged. You kept the names plain and the moments simple, because simple truths carried best in a house where children might be awake. Leif smiled when you mentioned the rough rim of the shield, and he said the grip would be better before another season. We keep the pace steady here, and it may not have seemed like much then, but it mattered later when the spring roads opened. When the talking was done, you and Leif sat quiet, and the hall eased into the kind of hush that made the day feel finished. You thought of the road from Oath to harbour, from launch to return, and your gear had grown light again. Leif rose to go, put a hand on your shoulder, and said he would come early if the steersman called for repair work. You told him the chest was packed, and the axe would keep its edge until spring, and he nodded with the small grin he kept for calm times. The elder passed through once more, and wished you a quiet night, and you answered with thanks for a home kept in good order. You banked the coals and sat back on the bench with your boots mended and your cloths folded where they should be. Leif stepped into the dark and closed the door softly, and you let the quiet stay without needing to speak. You set your hands on your knees and let your eyes follow the firelight as it moved along the rafters in an easy run. You thought of grain in the chest, fish set by, and the even split that would keep the elder's house through the thaw too. You breathed slow and steady and sat within the night, ready for whatever work the next season would bring. And so, our voyage with the Viking raiders comes to an end. The oars fall silent, the fires burn low, and the longship drifts back into the mists of history. Until our next journey together, rest well, dream deep, and good night.